Hey, everybody. Thanks for jumping back into PLG Disrupt. The next session, we have Francis Brero, who is the founder and chief product officer at MadKudu. So MadKudu is the data science studio for marketers. And as a college math major, Francis has always strived to leverage his passion for numbers to drive growth. And for the past 10 years, he's helped marketing teams increase sales by using customer data. His years of experience led him to advise marketing strategies and tactics at companies like Slack, Shopify, and IBM. So today, this session will be talking about as a marketing leader at a product-led growth company, it is your responsibility to translate data into insights. And a key piece of developing a data strategy is the always talked about buzzword, artificial intelligence. But when and how should you use it? How do you make sure you're using the right type of AI for the problem at hand? So in this session, Francis will share how to build a successful data strategy for your PLG company. Amazing. Thank you for being here. Francis, over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Francis Brero here, the co-founder and chief product officer at MadKudu. We're the leading no-code data studio for marketers, and I've spent my career in solving challenges on the data side for marketers in different types of organizations, from the juggernauts of HP, IBM, to some of the rising stars like MongoDB and Miro. And one of the things that I've come to discover over that extended period of time is that data is a muscle that marketing teams haven't necessarily flexed that much. And so I'm really excited today to talk a little bit about why, as a CMO, you should be building a data strategy to be successful, and how that's particularly relevant, I think, in the PLG context. So as I said, really excited to be here and to be hosted by PLG Disrupt. So without any further ado, let's actually jump right into the content. Cool. So as I mentioned, right, in the past 10 years, we've seen to some extent what I would call a bit of a Cambrian explosion of MarTech. And there's been a few big fundamental shifts that have really happened in the background that I think are going to have a lasting impact. And today, I think this subject of having CMOs own a data strategy is a little bit controversial, but I think it is the result of all this new technology that's been coming out and like the big shifts that have been happening on the marketing side. And what I mean by this is that essentially marketers can no longer simply rely on a really good relationship with their CIO and their CTO. They actually need to be active contributors to strategy to make all the data that's available within the company actionable by the go-to-market team. And I think in general, there's often a very good rule of thumb that when you're trying to study the B2B marketing landscape, you can look at B2C to figure out what's going to happen next, because B2C marketers are very often ahead of the curve. And I believe this is particularly true in the context of their relationship to data, and looking at how the CDPs have evolved in marketing themselves to the CIOs, CTOs when they started as a marketing tool, I think is very telling of today what the power structure is within organizations, with CEOs, CIOs, and CTOs really having a lot of power and authority over decisions that are made. And that kind of leaves marketers behind to have to deal with the scraps and not necessarily be able to influence what tools to bring in, what kind of infrastructure to build to support the key initiatives that they're trying to drive. And that being said, marketing has become more technical than ever these days. And in today's case, right, when we're talking about PLG, I think the rise of product-led growth has made it more obvious than ever that B2B companies are entering a strong data-driven era that's going to bring a lot of challenges. Some challenges that we've seen in the past of having companies be very data-rich but information poor. This is something that we've seen in B2C companies, and some of them have managed to overcome that. So this is something that hopefully through this session, you'll be able to understand kind of why you need a data strategy, how we actually got to the point where we need one, how this, why this data strategy will actually be essential to building and supporting your different PLG funnels, and then kind of like how to evaluate the maturity of your current segmentation capabilities. So to some extent, a lot of this in my mind kind of, or at least this presentation became like pretty clear when I was talking to John Rakowski, who's like former analyst at Forrester and PMM at App Dynamics. And one of the things that he was telling me was that people talk a lot about data being the new gold and all of that. And for him, data is not the new gold. It's actually the new problem. And insights, however, are the new gold. So it's almost like data is the gold mine, but you need to extract the gold from the gold mine. And one of the things he went on to mention was that there's nothing more frustrating for his operations team than to have to go to talk to data science to get any kind of information from the data, because it creates that dependency and that reliance on another team that they have no authority over. And that struck a chord with me, because I think it rings particularly true in a PLG context where we generate huge amounts of customer data, and way more than your traditional enterprise go-to-market motion. And so I've seen my fair share of companies struggling to get any meaningful insight out of the mountains of data that are being generated. And the sad part is that in the end, a lot of them end up operating off of intuition and these kind of preconceived notions of what the onboarding should be, what's important, what isn't. And that seems crazy because they have so much data at their fingertips. And it's almost like considering, flying a plane without any of the instruments, even though they are there, right? So I think nobody should be piloting their business blindly, nor driving their go-to-market motions blindly. But unfortunately, until we have the tools to extract insights from that data, that's pretty much what's happening. And so the challenge that I think John was mentioning is really at the heart of marketing today. As marketers, our kind of core responsibility is to create a relevant customer journey. And one of the big needs that we have is to make sense of the crippling amount of data that our users generate in order to make our product experience better for them. And so you see one of the, I guess, like the biggest tectonic shifts that has happened in the past 10 years in go-to-market strategies, I would say, is the digitalization of the customer journey. And this has led us and has led customers to expect their journey to be customized, personalized based on their actions, their preferences, and all that stuff. Today, personalization is no longer some fancy differentiator that you can use. It's actually table stakes. And it's rather, if you don't do any personalization, you are going to lose customers. And this, to some extent, has in turn kind of created a new era of data native companies that have realized that there's a big advantage in being built with data as the kind of central neuralgic system, right? The data that they have about their users could almost be considered some kind of IP because it's giving them an edge. And again, like, looking at the B2C side, let's say if you look at Facebook or Google, they kind of obviously come to mind as companies that mainly derive their value from their ability to extract actionable insights from their raw user data. But we also start seeing B2B companies exploiting this to their advantage. And really that, I think, is this big shift that's happening that is critical to be aware of. And in that context, the role of the CMO has drastically evolved, again, from, I think, what, this awesome graph that Dave Rigotti put together a few years ago, where he was kind of, trying to depict the idea that CMOs have gone from this kind of like Mad Men era, like very brand centric, that gave us like some of the most memorable commercials out there, to kind of the channel optimization experts that we've seen that gave rise to this, inbound sales model, to what he's seeing today as kind of the operators, this kind of third stage of operators who need to use data to pilot initiatives in this, really strongly digital world. And I think PLG to some extent is really the poster child of this evolution, where it's taking us beyond the sales heavy demand gen model. And while this is, of course, pretty much an oversimplification of the situation, I think it carries a lot of value in depicting the change that we're seeing in roles and responsibilities of marketing organizations. And in reality, the role of the CMO is constantly growing in complexity. And I would look at this more like, new phases and new responsibilities rather than a switch from one to the other, right? That needs to be taken by marketing. And the way I see it today is a CMO needs to have a strategy for brand, for demand gen, and now more importantly for data. And those three are incredibly interconnected. I was mentioning a couple, minutes ago that we are in a digital world, and users expect a personalized journey. And so to maintain a modern brand, it is critical to offer a personalized experience. And this actually requires data in the background. And a year or so ago, Segment, like a B2B CDP in the Bay Area, was running this great billboard advertising campaign in the Bay Area. And the billboard read, "Good morning, LA." And below there's a little subtitle that said, "What good is bad data?" And I thought this was brilliant on many fronts. But I think mainly it was showing how personalization not only is critical, it also can be very detrimental to your brand if you do it incorrectly. And so there is an absolute need of good data to be able to do the right kind of personalization and make sure you don't lose customers off of that. And similarly, when we think about demand gen, like channels have been saturated for the past few years with like really competent marketers, competing over the same digital real estate. And this has led, companies to become more data driven and try to use data to run, the best kind of targeting to be very precise and understand the ROI of every single channel to make sure every dollar is spent almost perfectly. And so really there's a strong need for data acumen in the marketing side to be able to support these two other big components of the strategy. And so, behind all of this, there is a data strategy that I think goes beyond, just segmentation. But for today, we'll talk mainly about that. And so one of the elements that I think is critical to understand today is that the CDP, the CRMs, the marketing automation platforms, they are not your central customer data repository. And I think the sooner you accept that, the earlier you can move on and actually start building a solid MarTech infrastructure. More likely, especially if you have a PLG motion, or if you're thinking of adopting a PLG motion, what will happen is your company will adopt what is now being coined, as the modern data stack. And this modern data stack really centers itself around a data warehouse, like typically a Snowflake or Redshift or GCP, whichever it is, right? But I'll use Snowflake here just for simplicity. That's by no means an endorsement. And really the idea here is that, the cheap storage and the ability to just like pour all the data into Snowflake, is what makes it so attractive as this kind of like central piece for everything else. And then all the other tools are going to sit on top of it. And really then your automation platforms and all your execution tools, or what we call the production apps from a go-to-market perspective, those are going to be, sitting on top of the data warehouse and hopefully like getting some data fed into it. And for most of you here, hopefully this is not something that's new, but it's really important to understand that the big challenge that this modern data stack poses is that it was fundamentally designed and built for engineers. And you probably know this, right? Where it's very hard to get any information from Snowflake pushed directly back into HubSpot or Salesforce or Marketo or any of those. And that's because the modern data stack is designed to use tools like SQL, Git, ETL, or like any kind of data science concepts in addition to that. And what that means is that it's creating and reinforcing this high, dependence of the marketing team on their CTO to get any kind of resources from their team to support the required segmentations for their campaigns. And that's terrible, right? Because now as a marketer, you no longer can do your team, and you can no longer do your job without the help of engineers. And unfortunately, the engineers are typically busy building the product, and that typically creates a lot of friction within companies. And so maybe to give more clarity on kind of some of the funnels that that we're talking about and some of the reasons why we actually need this data, I wanted to quickly touch upon what I consider to be the typical 4 funnels of PLG organizations. And so every single PLG company that I've interacted with will have a different, what I call funnel mix of each of these, right? So in terms of contribution to pipeline or its revenue, each of these will have a different contribution, but generally each of them exists to some extent. And so quickly going over these just to explain them, you typically have your self-serve funnel, which is the biggest in volume, but generally lowest in pipeline contribution. And this is where you're looking at solo users or prosumers who adopt the product and then swipe the credit card. The data here is generally hosted in Snowflake as the main data layer, and you have analysts kind of looking at things to figure out where do we have bottlenecks, what are things that we could improve in the onboarding process to get faster from signups to revenue. And then you have your, I guess, like traditional like sales assisted funnel. It's a little bit more transactional. The idea here is that you want to figure out who are the heavy product users and push them to a sales team to help them kind of like swipe their credit card or give them a white glove onboarding. Typically, because you are involving salespeople, this funnel is going to be supported and powered in the CRM so that your reps know who to ping with their personalized outreach campaigns. This one typically is, like the traditional kind of PQL motion that we hear a lot about. Then the third one is the bottom up. And I think this is probably the most advanced strategy and on the PLG side, and maybe the most challenging on the instrumentation side. And the idea here is to go beyond, PQLs and users, but rather look at things at the account level. And the premise and what leads companies to actually have to adopt this is they start realizing that having one person from Facebook being super active in your product doesn't mean that Facebook is ready to engage in a enterprise plan purchase discussion. And so that's why you need to have a more, account-driven segmentation of your product usage. And so most of the customers that I've seen build this internally or run some kind of prototype will typically have some kind of a Tableau or like Looker dashboard that they put together that surfaces the accounts based on number of active users in the last 30 days. And then they have reps kind of log into that report and cherry pick the accounts they want to go after based on the high levels of activity. And then, instrumenting this afterwards into a more automated fashion in Salesforce is really difficult. And finally, you have your typical top-down or ABM funnel, however you want to call it. This is a more traditional kind of enterprise go-to-market motion where you define target accounts and then you start running activities to generate engagement with those. Typically on a more like marketing activity, right? You're not necessarily pushing them to sign up for the product, you're rather trying to get them to register for webinars and things like that because you're targeting companies that have a level of compliance that might not allow them to, get value from the product because they can't just connect their data onto your platform. And so the interesting thing about this is then kind of if we take a different perspective at this and we try to figure out what is the potential for each of these to contribute to pipeline and what is their impact today on pipeline, what we generally see is that the vast majority of pipeline is going to come from this, traditional sales assisted funnel with some, typical marketing motions, right? We might have some demo requests. We have some people who like answer to salespeople after getting value from the product and so on and so forth. Then there's your typical top down where you have a few enterprise opportunities every quarter. And this is like your big whales that come in to fill the top line every quarter and, justify the investment in your more traditional enterprise marketing, today branded as ABM for the modern marketer. But I think the most interesting part about this in the context of PLG, right, is there's a massive amount of untapped pipeline sitting in your data warehouse with product users, right? And when we start looking at data here, what typically is going to happen is you start looking at who's active in your product and you're going to find some terrific leads in there that have signed up or actively using the product on a daily or even weekly basis. Some of them might even have already swiped their credit card and they're just hoping to never have to talk to a salesperson. And one of the challenges about this is that these leads exist in your system, but unfortunately your reps are never going to see them because they live almost in a parallel data universe that as a marketing team, you can't really access on a daily and ongoing basis. And that's because the volume of users is generally so big that it makes it really hard to push that data into, a Marketo or a Salesforce. And this problem is probably familiar, but this is where really the biggest challenge lies for you on the marketing side, is extracting as much value as possible from that pool of users, because this bottom-up motion can really be a game changer for your organization. But the challenge is typically marketing is going to have to go through engineering to get some resources to build that looker report or build some automation to push the data in. And this is not something that is, specific to startups. Actually, I was talking to last week, talking to François Dufour, who's the CMO at Twilio, and he actually came to the same realization. He was seeing there was a ton of value to be captured from these self-serve accounts, but unfortunately, his team could not access that data. And so he asked engineering to hire people to build the initiative, and they refused because they just didn't have, the open recs. And so he brought this up to the board, and finally managed to get approval from the board for engineering to hire 2 data scientists on their own budget, but allocate those data scientists to this project of figuring out how to get value from the self-serve and, more importantly, bottom-up funnel. The interesting thing is so they hired the data scientists, and they were able to build like a process that would highlight some accounts for sales. But unfortunately, 2 things. The first thing is building that took 8 months, right? So building that project took 8 months, during which the sales team was not able to tap into the bottom-up funnel. And more importantly, once they had built this kind of like model or like dashboard that they had put together, they were then promptly assigned to new projects within your engineering organization to work on something else. And so what this means is that post, these initial 8 months of building the project, then François got, a first version of an end result and had no ability to iterate on it or to take, into account feedback from the sales team to actually make changes, because there was nobody to support this initiative. And so what he was mentioning is that now he kind of like deeply regrets at the time not realizing that he needed to own a data strategy sooner and start working on, your typical 3 pillars of people, process, and product, to ensure that he and within his team had the capabilities to execute on his marketing strategy, which in this case was going after these product users. And this, again, is very, very specific to segmentation, but I do think it illustrates the problem with our lack of data strategy and how it can hurt us in the long run, because we're going to go and look for short-term solutions like, getting data scientists to help us. And so maybe you're past that stage, and you're at a point where you actually have been able to to get more resources to go beyond kind of a first draft, and now you're looking at automating this process. And this is actually the representation of the tech flow that one of our customers put together. And the idea here is that, again, the CMO had realized there's a ton of value in being able to take in, a lot of the product data that we have, so that we can run segmentation and we can be more personalized in our flow. And so he had his marketing ops person put together some high-level requirements of what was needed, like what kind of data needed to be pushed into Marketo. And it was essentially saying, hey, like, we know that these 5 events are typically really important and they're core to people getting value from their products. So what would be super helpful is if we could actually make sure that we pipe that data from Snowflake into Marketo. Because the volume of data was too big, there was like a little aggregation layer that was happening in the center where it would say, okay, we're going to count the number of times this event was done in the last 30 days. And that number is what we're going to push back into Marketo. And again, this worked really well initially. It gave them a couple months of happiness where everyone was saying, oh, it's so amazing to see product data in Marketo, and therefore in Salesforce. Reps were happy. Everyone was happy. Unfortunately, a few months later, the product team had released new features that were awesome. And these features were actually very relevant to the customer journey. So the marketing team and the sales team wanted to have, the aggregations updated to make sure that they could take into account these new events that were happening. But unfortunately, that required modifying elements of this really complex stack that we're looking at. This required, having an initiative that was documented, approved by engineering, to then go into an engineering sprint and then wait for it to make it to the top of the engineering sprint. And again, we end up with these competing desires of, marketing and trying to, sell the product, but then product and engineering actually working on building the product. And this again led to the situation where nothing happened and nothing moved for a couple months. And by the time the team was able to start making the changes, kind of marketing and sales had moved on with their lives and they're thinking about something else, because you can't just wait for 3 months before driving your next initiative. And so that's like one of the challenges, again, of like being so dependent on engineering and not having a data strategy that puts together requirements for capabilities within the marketing team to be able to solve for the needs that you have. I do want to say one thing is that a lot of folks are going to address this problem by just, buying tech and just like layering on some more tech to solve this kind of, I guess, like siloed problem. And that in itself is another problem and is not a solution, right? And so that's why I something that I can't remember which advisor, but one of our advisors mentioned once, and he was talking about ABM, and he was saying, ABM is not something you buy, it is something you do. And I think that is true for a lot of the MarTech tools that are out there. Right? When I look at how a lot of people approach ABM, there's really this idea that you're going to get a lot of value. You have this problem where you want to feed your enterprise sales reps with relevant target accounts and know when they're engaged, and kind of like slap an ABM piece of technology on top of that that's going to create a little bit of a siloed data infrastructure where they might have, the shadow funnel with some intent data, but then that doesn't plug into product activity. So what we typically see on the PLG side is you're going to have accounts that are engaged on the shadow funnel. They might be researching a lot of stuff that relates to your product, but you have a blind spot on who within these target accounts are potentially even using the product and might actually be paying today on a solo plan for your product. And that's because, again, like you're keeping siloed data, and now you have almost one silo of data and technology by funnel that we were talking about. And that's a pretty big problem that needs to be addressed. And another, I think, good example of, us in marketing kind of like slapping technology on top of of one of these challenges, I think, is predictive lead scoring. At the core, I think predictive lead scoring is trying to solve a people/process issue where, sales and marketing can't seem to agree on what makes a good lead that sales can go after. And so instead of doing the hard work of coming to an agreement and figuring out what actually is a good lead, kind of slap some good old AI and machine learning on top of it. And so we expect everything to be good because the machines are going to tell us who are the right people to talk to. And that, typically has a positive impact early on in the release of that product or the introduction of the product within the company, because people get excited about the premise of a world of alignment between sales and marketing. However, what we see is that the nightmare really happens when we kind of roll this out and, people don't agree and it's a black box and we don't know why we're doing this. And what we realize is that by not having solved some of the more, fundamental elements of alignment, slapping that technology on top of it is not going to help. And people typically revert back to systems that support their own, I guess, like beliefs. And one of the core values, though, of going through an exercise of onboarding and predictive lead scoring, I think, is actually doing the onboarding, right? Because during the onboarding, you have to have these conversations of what are we trying to achieve? Why do we think we need lead scoring? And what do we think makes a good opportunity? And so what's interesting there is that, again, we go back to, in any kind of problem, there's always a combination of, people, process, and product. And very often, I think in marketing, we have this risk of just slapping on technology. And there are a lot of tools out there that will tell you, oh, we solve like the PQL problem. Oh, you want to have like product leads sent to sales? Like we actually do this. And the one thing I will really, really caution you with is those are great, but they are essentially just going to build yet another silo. And you're essentially buying tech, you're putting a band-aid on, on a big problem, because it's, rather than figuring out, okay, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the capabilities that we have? What are the capabilities that we need? And how do we build a team that can actually do this by having the right people, the right capabilities with product, and the right processes to surface these leads to sales? Slapping on a piece of technology can be great as a proof of concept or a prototype, saying, okay, let's use one of these tools to see if there is actually any value in tapping into our self-serve leads. But ultimately, it has to be, within the perspective of building something grander and making sure that you have a more solid go-to-market motion. So I think a lot of these tools are awesome for prototyping because they have everything built in, so you can quickly validate your hypothesis, but generally they're not a very good long-term solution. And I think like another element that's interesting about the product-led environment is we do generate, as I mentioned early on, right, a lot of data compared to our more traditional go-to-market strategies. And that can seem crippling. It can seem overwhelming, where we think, oh, well, like nothing is going to work, right? Marketo doesn't work in a PLG context because I can't just pipe all the event data into it. Same for HubSpot, same for Salesforce. And so we kind of tend to feel like there's nothing we can do because of the huge amounts of data that we're getting. But one thing I do want to bring up is, yes, that's true, but you're not Google, right? The scale and the level of challenges that we're dealing with at our PLG companies is still fairly minimal. And so one of the things that I see a lot of companies struggle with is going into a bit of this paradox where they start looking to design solutions that would, work at the scale of a Google. And this is something that I think is, inherited from the fact that a lot of the PLG infrastructure is very engineering driven. And, this problem of feeling that you're Google is a very common problem in engineering, where, engineers will read the latest tech implemented at Google, at LinkedIn, at Facebook, and they want to bring it to their companies because like, oh, if it scales at Google, then it will scale at my company that gets, maybe 1 million visitors a month, or maybe, 1 million active users, which is nothing compared to Google. I mean, this picture here is one picture of the hundreds of data centers that Google, has to host their data. And they basically stopped at 4 stories of servers when they were kind of wondering like, oh, how many stories of servers should we have? And they said, yeah, okay, like 4 floors of servers is probably enough for, our hundreds of data centers. It's like, this is not the scale that you operate at. So it's, it's fine. There's a lot that we can learn from what they do, but it's also important to realize that a lot of what we do is relatively simple and relatively low data. And what we need is really the ability to iterate quickly and maximize leverage rather than it is focus on scale. And I think this is something that a lot of companies get wrong, because they very, very quickly focus on how do we scale our capabilities rather than focus on how do we build capabilities that support our need for quick iteration. And that being said, I fully acknowledge PLG data doesn't fit into Salesforce, and that is essentially why the modern data stack has come to rise, and why Snowflake is such a dominant player, I think, in the B2B space. And so ultimately, yeah, your problems aren't that big, and they can very often be solved by smaller approaches. And I would almost look at it as when you think about allocating budget for ad spend, right? Let's say if you're spending let's say you're spending like $20 million a year on ads, right? You didn't go from 0 to 20 million in a month. You took specific channels, you tested them, you invested more and more, and slowly over time you grew to this level of spend that you are at now. And this is the same thing here. You want to figure out, you want to be able to find what works and then think about scaling it. And you can think about scaling it, with agencies, internal toolings, technology, but ultimately that's a question of how do we do more of what we've already seen value from. And that's the part that I think so many companies get wrong, of focusing on scale, 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 and kind of like thinking, oh my God, like we need to be like Google, rather than thinking about all the iterations that Google went through to become who they are today. Like iterating quickly should be the core of how you design your data infrastructure and how you think about building this data strategy. So I'd say focus on getting tooling that's going to help your team maximize their leverage and leverage the data that is supporting your marketing strategy. And so one of the things that that'll be available for you afterwards, kind of as a self-assessment tool, is these are some of the, I would say, like basic segmentation capabilities that I recommend people have within their organization for each of the funnels. And if you think of it like each level here from top to bottom is essentially a level of maturity or complexity. And so typically what you want to strive for is, for whatever funnel is the core funnel that's generating most of your pipeline, you want to make sure that you have the capabilities to support the last level of maturity, right? So if sales assisted is, let's say, your core go-to-market, your core funnel in the PLG context, then you want to make sure that you're at a point where your data actually supports a persona-based segmentation, where you're kind of isolating different types of users so that you can surface the right messaging to sales, that everything, like from the onboarding to the messaging of people reaching out to them, everything is going to be personalized to who they are and very, very relevant. And so that's where you want to separate if you have a potential user of the product who signed up versus a potential admin versus a potential buyer. You don't want to push them towards the same features, and you don't want to have the same messaging towards what the value of the product is going to be. And so similarly, then I would say on the next funnel, so potentially like the second and third kind of funnels where you're starting to see value, I would encourage at least getting to capabilities that support level 2. And so these are, I won't go over each and every one of these, but the idea here is really think of it, if this is our, to some extent, almost like roadmap from a capability perspective and how we want to market to our users, then what do we need in the background to be able to support this? And that's how you start putting together that data strategy I was talking about, of figuring out, what people, like we need capabilities, we need people to operate these different products we have in the background, and we need processes to figure out how we surface these folks to our go-to-market channels. And so before I leave you with these thoughts, I think this might be a little bit new, and potentially you've never heard of, marketers needing a data strategy, but I am really convinced that data infrastructure for the next 5 years is probably going to be the new challenge for marketers, and figuring out how to leverage that data is going to be incredibly critical. And I think we are, if we look at the typical like hype cycles, I think we are at a point where we're getting into the slope of enlightenment, right? So we had kind of Netflix trigger all of this with opening marketers' eyes to the fact that data can be a strong competitive advantage, and that it should be prioritized within organizations. Then I think predictive lead scoring, and to some extent led us to the peak of inflated expectation to the trough of disillusionment, where we started hoping that we could just, throw data into a machine and have all of our problems solved. Unfortunately, kind of came to realize that it can't, like these problems cannot just be solved with technology. And now we're coming to the point where people are starting to understand there's like a more complex strategy that needs to be put together in the background, and tools are also being developed out there to support this vision. And maybe an analogy that I'll leave you with, that hopefully will explain or will help you be even more convinced about this, is web developers. So, 10 years ago, when you were trying to design a website or build a website, you would typically get a web developer from the engineering team to come and help on the marketing side. And then at some point, marketers are going to start to realize, well, they actually needed that web developer more often than not. And it was a bit of a pain to constantly go through engineering. So we started having open recs in marketing for a web developer. And that worked well. And so now we had these, marketers with strong web development skills. And slowly we've seen the emergence of these no-code tools, if you think of a Webflow or things like that on the CMS space, that are actually saying, well, marketers should be focused on doing marketing, and they should have technology that helps them, do that marketing without having to become engineers. And so I think the emergence of no-code platforms like Webflow is actually something that is not going to stop, and that we are going to see even more and more on the CMS front. I think that's pretty obvious, right? I don't think today you would consider going back to hiring an engineer to be able to build your website rather than using one of the low-code, no-code platforms that are out there. And I think on the data side, we are exactly in the same motion. We went from, today we're still in this motion where you need to go get, data engineers, so data scientists from the engineering team to help you with your projects. And then at some point you realize, well, actually in PLG, we have a lot of data needs. So maybe we should have an open headcount in our marketing team to handle the data. But that again, doesn't necessarily work. And we're starting to see the emergence of no-code platforms like MadKudu that actually are designed to give marketers the data mining capabilities they need to support their overall marketing strategy. And so I think it's really critical as a marketer that you start thinking about how you put together a data strategy that is going to support your marketing strategy. And investing in low-code, no-code platforms, I think, is something that definitely warrants spending a lot of time into. And so finally, just kind of as a conclusion and summarizing a little bit of what we talked about today, I think the core in figuring out how to design, this data strategy and data architecture is focus on data actionability, right? How do you make the data actionable by your sales team, and how do you promote quick iteration capabilities? The second part is, remember, you're not Google. Like, keep it simple. It might be scary initially because you think it's like huge amounts of data, but it's actually not necessarily that complicated. And there's a lot that you can do to get started and iterate. And again, iteration is key and is the one thing you should be optimizing for. And the last part is start investing time in, looking for low-code, no-code solutions that are out there. Like, educate yourself towards what are the tools out there that are helping marketers be more data savvy and increase the data capabilities of marketing teams out there without, having to bring on a data engineer. And so this goes without saying, but, this was, a very short introduction to this concept. And I really hope that at least it got you thinking about owning a data strategy and not, being too dependent on, your CIO or CTO to come up with that data strategy to support your overall marketing strategy. I think it's really critical for modern marketers to come to the realization that the modern data stack is here to stay, and that you have to be an active contributor to that modern data stack if you want to be able to keep your destiny within your hands, rather than just be constantly dependent on engineers. So that's it for me today. Hopefully this was helpful. Excited to go a bit of the questions that you folks might have. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the awesome Disrupt event that's been put together. And feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Francis and team, thank you so much. That was awesome, especially being a marketing leader myself. There were so many awesome takeaways from that session. So, and another amazing one. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you all at the next session.